Thank you for joining us, everyone. My name is Katie Rowley, and I want to welcome you to the Noaa Environmental Leadership Seminar Series. The goal of these seminars is to showcase examples of Noaa's leadership in environmental science by those who lead it and make it happen. I'd like to take a moment for a few webinar details. First, I would like to thank the Noaa Science Council and the awesome team I work with in putting together these seminars, without whom none of this would happen. Hernan Garcia with the Noaa NESDIS National Centers for Environmental Information, Tracy Gill with the Noaa NOS National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, and Sandra Klar with the Noaa NESDIS Office of the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer. We often have staffers assist us for the Noaa Leadership Seminars during the Q&A, and today we have Marnie Brown and Dwayne Bola, both with the NESDIS Office of Satellite Ground Services, who will be moderating the questions and answers along with Tracy Gill. Second, I would like to share some seminar logistics. These are also listed in the Q&A box online. All attendees are muted. Please type all of your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we will address as many of them as we can at the end of the seminar. If your system is lagging or the audio is breaking up, it's good to close any apps or browser pages you are not using to free up bandwidth space. Other suggestions for improving your webinar experience are listed in the Q&A box. We are recording this seminar for later viewing, and the link where it will be posted is in the Q&A box as well. And our speaker is Ajay Mehta. Ajay is the newly named director of the Noaa NESDIS Office of Satellite Ground Services. Congratulations, Ajay, on your new position. Ajay is the first director of the newly created NESDIS Office of Satellite Ground Services organization. This office will manage, develop, and sustain all the separate NESDIS ground systems in an integrated ground enterprise. Here he will be leading ground sustainment efforts for operational satellite systems in low Earth, geostationary, and deep space orbits. Ajay will also be leading the transformation and transition of NOAA's ground systems data ingest, processing, dissemination, and archival capabilities to the cloud. He will be overseeing development and sustainability of the enterprise on-premise systems and implementing an enterprise-wide product portfolio management program. Ajay has served in numerous leadership and management roles in both the public and private sectors, including serving on joint NOAA and NASA governance boards, Deputy Director of the Joint Polar Orbiting Satellite System, Deputy Director of the Office of Satellite and Product Operations, Management of the NOAA Satellite Operations Facility in Suitland, Maryland, Management of 2 Command and Data Acquisition Stations, Wallops Island, Virginia, and Fairbanks, Alaska, serving as a U.S. representative to the COPAS SARSAT Council. And with that, Ajay, the microphone is yours.
All right. Thank you, Katie. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Hernan, Tracy, Sandra, and others for inviting me to speak to you about change. By the way, if you ever want to boost to your ego, have someone read your resume. Always sounds great. I'm hoping to take this opportunity to share with you my experiences and lessons learned from the various reorganizations and organizational changes that I've gone through during my time at NOAA, and mostly within NESDIS. While the focus of my conversation is about change, I also want to touch a little bit on agility, a key component to change. It's not really possible to change without having some agility. So before we get started, I wanted to share with you 2 personal experiences on this subject. Let's start with some inspirational quotes on change. Here you see we have thoughts on change from Charles Darwin, Barack Obama, Gandhi, others. You'll also see the quote in the middle from Paul White. Don't bother Googling Paul. You won't find the one I'm talking about. Paul's a close friend of mine. We've been vacationing with Paul and his family and another close friend's family since our kids were born. We go to the Outer Banks every year, and every year we rent a pontoon boat off for a sunset dinner sail on the Sound side. Here you see some of the pictures. This is us out on the pontoon boat. You can't see Paul's face. He's the one in the blue shirt off to the right there. One of the things our kids love doing is swimming off the back of the boat. A couple of years ago, it was getting dark, and we decided it probably wasn't a good idea for the kids to go swimming. As you can imagine, 4 preteens were not happy. It's at that moment that Paul, clearly frustrated arguing with the kids, uttered his famous words that still resonate with all our families today. Things change. Short, succinct, and non-negotiable. I think we've even had T-shirts made with that tagline. It's an important takeaway for all of us, for indeed, things change. Change is hard, and it's not easy for us to adapt to a new environment. One thing to remember is that we shouldn't be surprised or disappointed that it's hard to change. It's a fact of life for most of us. We're hardwired to resist change, although most of us would say we welcome change or are actively seeking to change. I think some of you have seen this cartoon in the upper left-hand corner. Everyone has their hands up when the question is asked, who wants change? And then you can feel the silence in the room when the question is asked, who wants to change? This is basically us. Psychologists refer to this need to maintain a state of equilibrium as homeostasis. Homeostasis can be psychological or physiological. As an example, homeostasis describes the manner in which our body temperature is regulated. When our body senses that it's too hot, our sweat glands make us sweat to cool down, or when we're too cold, our muscles shiver to create warmth. Emotionally or psychologically, our minds work the same way. Our brain interprets change as a threat and releases hormones for fear, flight, or fight. Our minds are always protecting us against change. Now, you may think I'm an adaptable type, especially as I'm here today to talk to you about change. Let me share with you my other personal story. Several years ago, a group of Noaa LCDP program graduates got together to hold a one-day session on change. It was a long time ago, and frankly, I don't remember the details. I do remember that we held the session on the second floor of SSMC 2, which you see in the picture here, and we all had to complete a change readiness assessment. This was basically a survey that assessed our acceptance of change and our ability to adapt. I recall the facilitator had all our scores and lined us up in order of our willingness to change without revealing our scores. I think I was one of the first ones called up to the front of the room and placed in line. As more and more people were called up, I noticed that everyone was lining up to the left of me. About halfway through the process, I started to get a little cocky. I always prided on myself, on my flexibility and adaptability, and for a while there, I figured, I'm one of the most flexible people in the room, one of the key SES competencies. Imagine my surprise when the facilitator revealed how the people were lined up. Of the 25 to 30 people in the room, I tested most resistant to change. It took a while, but I began to see how nervous I've been when my work environment changes or when people leave. This doesn't necessarily make me resistant to change, nor does it become debilitating. It does make me uncomfortable. So I'm going to throw a couple Dilbert cartoons out here just to keep you entertained. I want to walk through several cases or examples of change I've experienced over the past 10 or so years in NESDIS. I want to make it perfectly clear that these cartoons do not portray any actual leaders in Noaa, past or present, but I do think they capture the sentiment of the staff and how they feel. So I'll just let you read this for a second. Now let's start with the first case. In 2011, NESDIS underwent a reorganization to combine 2 offices, the Office of Satellite Operations and the Office of Satellite Data Processing and Distribution. Prior to the reorganization, we had 2 offices involved in the end-to-end delivery of satellite data to users. The combined organization was, and still is, fairly large, more than 300 civil servants, 250 affiliates, and a current budget of about $180 million. The facilities shown on the right here are spread out between 4 locations in 3 states. And at the time of the reorganization, we continued to operate under 2 PPAs, Program, Project, and Activities codes. This further complicated the integration of the 2 offices. Most importantly, the offices operated under 2 different cultures. This wasn't a case of good or bad necessarily. Each of the organizations employed a culture that was suited for its mission. The Office of Satellite Operations necessarily was much more internally focused and was fairly rigid in its operations and had very clear lines of authority. This was absolutely necessary to safely control billions of dollars worth of satellite investment in space. And you needed to do this just so that you were operating our satellites in a consistent and repeatable manner. The Office of Satellite Data Processing and Distribution was different. While it too had hierarchies and control mechanisms, especially when it came to operating computer systems, it was externally focused on users and service delivery. Its management structures were more distributed, and the staff comprised more scientists and engineers. The first reorganization plan submitted basically continued to have 2 discrete functions with 2 deputies, one to oversee the satellite command and control functions, and one to oversee the data processing functions. This was done to turn the reorganization package around quickly. The director at the time found this was unacceptable and pushed for more time to provide a reorganization plan that truly integrated the end-to-end delivery of products and services. So some lessons learned. I think the most important lesson learned from this experience is that you must have a champion for the change. It's easy to have organizational leadership, such as a AA or DAA, support the change, even advocate for it, but that's not the same as a champion. A champion makes him or herself accountable for not only implementing the change, but for its success. Our director and I were engaged at every step and at every level to make this happen. There was resistance, especially at the mid-manager levels throughout the whole organization. Some of the resistance was simply supervisors and managers protecting their employees from yet another reorganization. For some, it was protecting their turf. And for others, it was just not having a clear vision of the reason for the change and the benefits. The solution was for the champion to engage staff at all levels directly, to both educate the staff on the reorganization and, equally as important, to collect their thoughts and concerns. This type of dialogue only works if the champion is involved. It can't be delegated or outsourced. By the way, we got this idea from Admiral Lautenbacher. Some of you will recall that when he was the administrator, he established a program review team comprising staff throughout the organization to review NOAA top to bottom and make recommendations. The key being engage staff at all levels. Next, it's important not to surprise the staff and be as transparent as you can. As I mentioned before, we took 2 passes at the reorganization package. The first one was basically a surprise to a lot of the staff as it was done quickly. Second time around, we engaged staff at different levels and provided them an idea of what was coming. You know that decisions thrust on people suddenly, allowing them no time to adjust or prepare for the impact, are generally resisted. Our natural resistance kicks in, and our response is typically no. Our organizations are usually smaller than we think they are, and it's hard to plan things like a reorganization in secret. People usually find out, so it's better to engage staff early. Another lesson learned, it's hard for staff to deal with loss of control. I think this is closely tied to the bullet above that I just mentioned on no surprises. What we were proposing as part of this reorganization are some new reporting chains and new divisions. So amplifying the loss of control with the feeling that one organization was being subsumed by another. It's important when we go through a reorganization like this that we leave room for those affected by change, some latitude in the implementation. This gives people the ability to make choices and decisions, and also gives them ownership over the change. If I can take a quick tangent, I remember being on detail to the Office of Response and Restoration within NOS when they underwent a reorganization. This is like 10 to 15 years ago. I was struck by the fact that employees had an opportunity to comment on where they thought they could best support the new organization. Could the management accommodate everyone's wishes? Obviously not, but the fact that the question was asked was appreciated. Finally, when you merge organizations, technical folks can quickly focus on tools for things like configuration or risk management, with groups advocating for one tool or another. This leads to unnecessary confrontation, and usually the discussion is premature. It's more important to focus on processes, specifically taking the time to identify efficiencies or other improvements. This provides the staff a hand in defining how they will operate in the future and hopefully lessening the impact of the change. I also want to quickly touch on change management and broader organizational change. There is a slight difference. You can see on this slide, this is a slide I borrowed from a effort we have currently underway to migrate some of our capabilities to the cloud. The takeaway here is that change management focuses on processes, tools, and skills, while organizational transformation incorporates mindset or culture, and that is an important element for success. All right, let's look at the next case. Give me a chance to read the comic here. This certainly captures how I feel sometimes. Okay, so the President's FY 2011 budget, which was released back in February of 2010, announced the restructuring of the NPOS program, which was originally created to combine the military and civilian polar orbiting satellite programs. Restructuring was a nice way of saying it terminated the NPOS program and proposed that the Air Force build their own weather satellites, and NOAA and NASA partner to build the civilian polar orbiting weather satellites. The NPOS program was canceled as it was over budget and behind schedule and had many technical challenges to overcome. The restructure significantly increased NOAA's budget for the program, which was receiving less than $400 million a year up to that point. The FY 2011 budget request was for about $1 billion, most of it going to NASA, but NOAA being held accountable to our sponsors. The expectations were high, and there was a lot of scrutiny on the program. The National Space Policy and White House direction at the time called for the program to be jointly implemented by NOAA and NASA, without really providing clear guidance on what that meant. The resulting structure was one that was complicated, to say the least. There was a program office comprising NOAA staff and contractors. There was also a separate NASA program office at the Goddard Space Flight Center, primarily composed of NASA staff and contractors, with a handful of NOAA personnel embedded. Directions, authority, requirements, funding all flowed from the NOAA program director to NASA headquarters, which in turn flowed the direction and funding back to Goddard. And literally, our offices were less than a couple hundred yards apart. There was also an independent technical authority pathway that existed that allowed NASA engineering and safety staff to elevate issues using yet another path if there were serious concerns about safety or mission assurance. The overall arrangement was inefficient and hard for NOAA to influence or direct lower levels of the flight or ground systems. Underlying these technical and management challenges were the difference in cultures between the two agencies. And let me touch on those a bit. So this slide provides a high-level view of the key differences between NOAA and NASA that drive our cultural differences. Let's start with the legislative mandates. You can see we have a whole bunch. I think I pulled the slide from an old briefing when it used to say 127 mandates, but I think the number has increased significantly over the past few years. As some of you probably know, Congress was never able to pass a NOAA Organic Act, while NASA does have a single authorizing act. These individual mandates make it much harder for NOAA to act as one organization. In terms of our mission, NOAA, everyone knows, is science, service, and stewardship, but certainly focused on applying science to our various mission service areas. We also have a very important stewardship mission, whether that's protecting the environment or preserving data. NASA's mission is focused on research and exploration. This difference manifests itself when we talk about users. NOAA's products and services are seldom for internal use. We're either co-trustees or we deliver our services to external users at every level of government. Oftentimes, we are partners in delivering that service. Think of our role in coastal zone management or our various stewardship roles. We are seldom the only player involved. This is very different from how NASA operates, especially our partners at Goddard. The end user for their individual satellite missions is usually a principal investigator or an internal user. The culture with respect to building or leveraging partnerships was very different between the two halves of the JPSS program. This also affects how NASA views risks and schedules. For example, a single satellite can sometimes be viewed as an entire mission, so they may be okay with delaying it until it can meet all their science needs. For NOAA, a mission probably involves multiple satellites, and schedules are more important to us, as well as managing risk across the whole constellation of satellites. Let's look at the political leadership that the program had to deal with within both agencies. As you know, our DOC leadership is mostly from the business or political worlds. NASA's political leaders have been astronauts, scientists, and engineers. What does this mean? It's been much easier for NASA to engage leadership and represent the views of programs and projects, while we've had to go through multiple layers to elevate the status of our programs. These programs and projects are also managed differently at the two agencies. NOAA tends to have a hierarchical structure, while NASA operates in a matrix structure. For example, systems engineers, safety and mission assurance personnel, and resource management staff are typically matrixed to a program from other parts of NASA, other NASA organizations. This model worked for some of the NOAA staff, while others had a much more difficult time adjusting to operating this way. The final distinction, and one you probably won't find in writing anywhere, is that the project is king at Goddard, a term I've heard from Goddard management themselves. While Goddard also has programs, it's the project manager that really commands respect and can usually communicate directly with Goddard leadership. This is a strange concept for NOAA staff, which usually focuses on the program manager as a primary authority. So let's look at some lessons learned. Frankly, we could have a whole session on just the cultural differences between NOAA and NASA and the lessons learned from NPOs. That could be a separate topic on its own. But that said, there are some key takeaways I'd like to share. Preparing for a change of this magnitude is important. We were terminating a multi-billion-dollar program between 3 agencies and standing up another one midstream between 2 agencies. On top of that, we had the OIG and GAO highlighting the risk of a gap in critical observations, as well as technical and management challenges. When the President's budget and plans became public, some of us were scrambling to figure out its implications and how to align staff to support the new joint program. However, it seemed like NASA had involved a lot more people in getting ready for the new program. The end result was that they had a leg up on establishing a clear role in the partnership. So while NOAA had the overall accountability for the program, they had a limited role in actually managing the program. I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk. Change is hard. In this case, it was even harder for the staff. There was a perception that some staff were cherry-picked for new roles on the program, while others were left without a home. Further complicating the situation was that some folks were forced to change their duty station to Greenbelt, losing easy access to public transportation in Silver Spring. Bottom line, there was a perception that how people were assigned to new roles was not done in a fair manner. It's important to be honest, transparent, fast, and fair. We've talked about how organizational change involves a mindset and culture change. On the surface, it's hard to change ourselves. We may accept that change is necessary. Think back to the cartoon I showed earlier. What's much harder is to adopt the culture of an organization that you think is replacing you. Recall what I said earlier, that the feeling you're being subsumed amplifies the loss of control you feel. That said, sometimes you must adapt to be successful. The people that could adapt to the NASA culture that I outlined in the previous slide found it a lot easier to be accepted in a matrix role within NASA and had a much easier time influencing individual projects. So for the last lesson learned, JPSS wasn't the first multi-billion-dollar satellite program within NOAA. GOES-R was established several years prior. What was different with JPSS was the increased visibility and involvement of the Commerce Department. At that time, we didn't have clear program or project management guidelines for these huge acquisition programs. Policies and guidelines like the department's Scalable Acquisition Project Management Guidebook didn't get published till much later. What we took advantage of was NASA's policies and processes. NASA probably spends millions developing their NASA procedural requirements, and many of them could be used by NOAA with a bit of tailoring. Over time, the department, NOAA, and NESDIS established the requisite governance and management guidelines to handle these large programs. But in the interim, we were able to leverage NASA's policies and procedures. All right, I'll let you take a quick look at our third case here. So this case looks at a budget restructure and organizational realignment that was proposed as part of the 2020 budget submission. And this was for all of NESDIS. One of NESDIS's operating paradigms is a future observing constellation that will leverage capabilities of our domestic and international partners, commercial data as well as in situ observations. Our international partners are now providing sensors that we do not have plans to provide, and we're already purchasing commercial data such as radio occultations. Our existing budget structure is ill-equipped to deal with these new opportunities as it's tied to our major acquisition programs. To solve this problem, NESDIS proposed a budget restructure that collapsed a number of PPAs into portfolios, similar to what the Weather Service did a couple of years ago. This was briefed through DOC, OMB, and released as part of the President's budget. We had several opportunities to talk about what we were trying to accomplish through quarterly briefs to the Hill, but we never really got an opportunity to have a focused discussion on the budget restructure. In the end, only two small parts of the budget restructure were approved. So, what do we learn? Let me emphasize that these are my observations and not necessarily the result of an organized hot wash. First, these types of budget restructures take time. Not surprisingly, congressional members and staff are also resistant to change. While changes like this may improve agency operations, the Hill tends to look at changes that can reduce costs, tangibly improve service delivery to its constituents, or are in response to some external recommendations. A particular challenge here was also the matter of control. The proposed approach was shifting control of resources to NESDIS away from the Hill. As an example, the JPSS program used to execute two different PPAs, one for our SUMI NPP, JPSS-1 and JPSS-2 satellites, and another PPA for the JPSS-3 and 4 satellites. So although we were using the same contract and staff, we had to manage two different financial accounts. This was inefficient and didn't allow us to allocate funds where they were required. So you would think combining the accounts would be fairly easy to justify. It still took several years for us of pushing for this through our budget process before Congress finally allowed us to combine the two accounts back in 20. The type of restructure proposed as part of our 2020 budget submission takes several years of persistent championing to get results. Next, clear and concise communication is required. The rationale found in our congressional justification was not enough to convince the Hill that we needed to manage our programs differently. Continuous engagement was necessary to clearly answer the questions they had, which is, what problem are we trying to fix? And more importantly, how does this help Congress? It's important to tailor the conversation for the audience, in this case, the Hill. I believe the Hill received the message on what we were trying to fix. Unfortunately, they believed we had other ways to meet our goals, and we didn't clearly communicate how the change helped Congress. When you're anticipating a long-term organizational transition, you have the challenge of determining how much to commit to the change and when. Basically, should you start, quote-unquote, acting as if you're in your new organizational structure, even if the official change is a year or two away? There's no clear-cut answer here. The benefit is obvious, assuming you're following all your legal and administrative constraints, and you get to move out on your desired end state and derive the benefits early if you start acting in your 2B state. You're also giving the staff an opportunity to test out the organizational structure and identify challenges or opportunities. The downside is, if the change is not approved, you perturb the staff unnecessarily and made it that much more difficult the next time around. In NESDIS's case, we also had the challenge that funds were appropriated into specific PPAs. It was hard for one office to manage and be accountable for funds in another financial management center. Initially, we were planning on moving out aggressively and implementing parts of the reorganization, but ultimately we pulled back and limited the new structure to higher level governance, which was a lot easier to implement. One of the positives was NESDIS's efforts to document the roles and responsibilities for each office or center in the reorganization. This was a lengthy and detailed effort, with the end result being a document that identified our accountabilities, our responsibilities, and the information flow in the new organization. The effort was supported by an executive sponsor, and each interim decision was approved by the AA. In the end, although the reorganization was not approved, we were able to use some of the output to adjust how we operated. Let's move on to the final case. This is my current office, our Office of Satellite Ground Services. I like this picture. So you've got the top floor corner office saying embrace change, and then you've got the staff reflecting their thoughts. Okay, so the context for this change. This is a transition underway, so we're still learning from our experiences here, but I can talk about the background a little here. The mission of the organization at its inception was to what we call sustain, enable, and create. It was to sustain our legacy systems. It was to enable the transition of the GOZAR and JPSS ground projects from the acquisition programs to routine operations and sustainment. And finally, it was to create a future common ground system. Over time, that mission scope changed. Federal and agency cloud strategies highlighted the benefits of migrating our existing capabilities to the cloud. And NESDIS is also implementing what we call product portfolio management, which is centralized and coordinated management of our higher level satellite products. Also, as part of the FY 2021 enacted appropriations, sustainment mission for our legacy systems, along with the budget and staff, so this was roughly 17 million and 13 people, were transferred to another office. What we were left with is a new mission scope under an old organizational structure. To provide a little more context, this slide shows when the organization was first established and all the various reorganizations proposed over the years. Some enacted, others just planned for or proposed. The vertical axis shows whether the change was planned, proposed to the Hill, or actually enacted. You can see that the organization was established in 2015, for which the planning started almost 2 years before then. Then there were small changes proposed or made over the next few years. The office was proposed to be reorganized as part of the broader NESDIS reorganization I spoke of earlier. And finally, the FY 2021 appropriation moved elements of the mission out. Right now, we're planning for another reorganization in 2023 to align the organization with its new mission scope. For the staff that's been here since the beginning, back in 2015, the threat and realization of change has been constant, and this can lead to what I call change fatigue. So some lessons learned here. I've already said people are resistant to change. Repeatedly forcing change on people makes us even worse. It's important to recognize change fatigue and then help staff navigate through constant change. I will say having a culture that's adaptive makes this a lot easier. And believe it or not, I feel Noaa on the whole is a pretty adaptive organization. So what can we do? One, it helps to focus on the highest priority elements of your organization that you're trying to change. Don't try to do everything at once. Focus the conversation on what's new and not necessarily on what's ending. This helps staff manage the stress of change. Also create an environment where it's safe for staff to share their views and sometimes just vent. What we are discovering is that the organization is also undergoing a cultural change, and it's a pretty significant one. Our traditional project management construct, where managers have a defined set of requirements and resources with which to meet those requirements, is changing. The migration to the cloud requires more integrated teams of developers, security personnel, operations personnel, and scientists. The projects we implement are also not easily defined at the beginning of the process. We're adopting more agile methodologies where incremental success is valued more than delivering all the desired capability at one time. This is not unique to Noaa or NESDIS. The broader public and private sectors are also adopting these agile methodologies. We, for our new product management function, the focus is on coordinating user needs, requirements, science outputs, and implementation in the cloud, not necessarily creating the end products. Again, not the traditional project management construct. So this requires us to commit to identifying and providing training to all staff, whether they're administrative, scientific, or technical. It's important to communicate directly with all staff, not just on the vision and strategy, but linking how staff's day-to-day work is tied to where the organization's going. For some, maybe the day-to-day work isn't changing. If that's the case, it's worth highlighting. And you've probably taken a step towards alleviating potential stress. For those staff members where the organizational changes are directly impacting them, it's important to communicate with them and tie their day-to-day work with the new goals of the organization. This is a great opportunity to promote how valuable staff members are. Any organizational change has the potential for staff to feel that what they were doing before either didn't work or doesn't matter. This naturally makes people defensive. Focusing on what has worked and how that is being leveraged moving forward help staff save face. So, in conclusion, a couple takeaways. Remember, people are naturally resistant to change. It's a lot easier to help them if we accept that fact. One thing that can help us is to reinforce that most times our core mission does not change, especially in the federal government, where there are legal statutes and administrative mandates that limit our flexibility. The change usually impacts how we operate, our strategies to adapt to a changing environment or our culture. The core mission continues to anchor us. And this is especially true for an operational organization like Noaa, where the public is relying daily on our products and services. Frequent, clear, and concise communication is important. This is up and out, as well as down and in. Invest the time and energy to make the change successful. It will pay dividends later. And finally, be cognizant of change fatigue. It can really sap morale. It introduces stress unnecessarily, and it can have the staff question their commitment. So, thanks for inviting me today. I hope the talk was informative. I can also share with you that as I was preparing the slides, I learned something important. Capturing lessons learned is one thing. Applying them is something else. After reading through my presentation, I realized I have more work to do in our own reorganization effort. I don't think I was following my own lessons learned. But let me leave you with a final cartoon. Thought this was timely and covered several of our Noaa mission areas. Hey, Dwayne, I think it's over to you for questions and answers.
Okay, we're going to quick jump to the webcams, AJ and Dwayne, if you would start your webcams. Hi, Dwayne.
Hi, Tracy. Thanks for having me on board on the webinar. All right, AJ, are you ready for Q&A? Oh, I'm sorry.
Start your webcam, too. Hold on, we're just going to wait for AJ to start his webcam. There we go. No problem. Great webinar, great presentation, AJ. Take it away, Dwayne.
All right, thanks, Tracy. All right, AJ, first question. How do you make staff feel valued and important?
I think I mentioned this before. It's important to focus on what worked, okay, and not focus on necessarily on what you're stopping to do, because that's where people get defensive, right? When you focus on, hey, we're not going to do this anymore, and you could have been doing something for 5 years, people naturally get defensive. If you want to make it valuable, you tie it to the mission. As I mentioned, our mission typically doesn't change, right? Our mission stays the same. It's how we're doing it that changes. So if you can anchor what people do in their day-to-day job to the mission, that helps people feel that their work is more valued.
All right, sounds good. All right, next question. What do you think are some of the best ways to keep Congress informed of your office's activities and accomplishments?
I like the quarterly briefs that Noaa has started making to the Hill. I think NESDIS may have been one of the first line offices to do that. It is a great way to keep both all organizations, all our stakeholders informed, DOC, OMB, and the Hill, because we usually have to clear the briefings through DOC and OMB before we can go to the Hill. Quarterly briefs they work well, and I believe the Weather Service is doing them now. I think if we continue doing that for all of our Noaa line offices, I'm not sure if others are doing it now, but it's a great way to keep them apprised of what we're doing. It's a great way to talk to them about changes we want to make. And as I mentioned, sometimes you need more focused discussions, but the quarterly briefs are a great way to share with the Hill what we're doing.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your answer. Next question is from Jordan. Is NESDIS actively engaging with staff about the future of remote work and telework?
They are. In fact, I should say, our COVID-19 has sort of forced another change on how we operate, right? We're being forced to work remotely. NESDIS, along with other offices, are looking at how we transition to a new work environment that leverages remote telework a lot more. So I know the line offices are going through what they call a telework suitability worksheet to help us identify which job series are good candidates for doing the work remotely. So we're also looking at other parts of the Commerce Department to see what PTO and others are implementing in terms of remote work. So yes, I fully expect the nature of our work in terms of being able to work remotely will fundamentally change going forward.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, next question. How do you handle branding for your new office during change?
That's a good question. It's not something I've thought of specifically, but I think it is an important component. It goes to, again, tying people's day-to-day work with what the office does, right? Having that branding helps people tie to what the office, helps tie their day-to-day work to what the office is doing. So I don't know that I have any specific recommendations or thoughts on it, but I think in general it's a good idea. Unfortunately, I don't know that I'm also the most creative person to come up with ways to brand the office. So sorry if I didn't completely answer that question.
Oh, no, it was a fair question. A fair answer as well. All right, next question. What are the qualifications for being a champion for organizational change, and who should ideally fill that position?
I don't know that there are any preset qualifications. One, I think you have to believe in the change. Okay, I think people see through if you're just advocating for a change without really being bought into it. So I think you have to believe in it. You have to be able to listen. So you've got to be able to engage people, right? You can't do this in an isolated fashion. So you've got to be able to work with people. You've got to be able to form partnerships. So those are some of the skill sets I think that are required. In terms of who should do it, I would recommend that you actually find people lower in the organization to champion it, right? Sometimes it's hard to have an FES or, like I mentioned earlier, AA or DAA really be the champion because, frankly, it takes time and effort, right? You've got our senior leadership that's busy with a lot of different things going on. For an office like this, I almost think you need to go a level below. You want to get some of your managers, some of your supervisors bought in, and they're probably the best to reach across the organization and try to implement change. So I would say don't always look for the office or the organization's leadership. Look a level below.
Great answer. I actually like that answer. The next question comes from Hernan. Sometimes there's one or more reasons for reorganization, such as budget, mission alignment, etc. How do we know it was successful without metrics?
Oh, just how do we know it's successful? Well,
without metrics.
Without metrics. Yeah, it's hard. It's clearly you're implementing some change to get a desired outcome or output, right? That's your best metric. But I think there are other things you could look at. You can look at turnover, right? You can look at people. Do people stay? Do people leave? If you could be successful in implementing an organizational change, but if everybody leaves, you really haven't brought people along, right? Now that, I guess you could consider that a metric, but that's one way is, are people bought in? It's more internal looking. Clearly there are other ways to measure externally whether you're successful or not. and that's whether you're able to deliver on your mission. But I think looking internally, look to see are people bought in. There are all kinds of organizational health, assessments. I know NESDIS has gone through what we call OHI, Organizational Health Index, I think, and that's been a great tool to identify what people are feeling about the organization, about the mission, about where we're headed, the vision. Unfortunately, those are all metrics. So, Ryan, I don't know if I answered your question there, but these are just some ways to see if your change is successful.
A very fair point. All right, next question. You've mentioned communicating clearly, listening, and being transparent multiple times, especially with affected staff. What did that look like, such as all-hands meetings, one-on-one, etc.? And how did you strike the right balance between listening, talking, and doing?
So to the first part of the question, yes. So one-on-one, all hands, anyway, this is something you can't necessarily over-communicate, because if you're the one communicating, it may seem like, I've said this 100 times, people should get it. People receive information at different rates. They receive information differently. So I don't think you can over-communicate. Do it as often as you can at every level, and there's benefits to the all hand, right? All hands give you a consistent message. There's a lot of value in doing it in smaller groups. One thing we found in our in the OSPO reorg was really having discussions at the branch level, right, where people felt more comfortable talking instead of a big all hands meeting. And then the one-on-one, right, so you can hear at a personal level what's making people uncomfortable. Can you repeat the second part of that question?
Second part of that question is, how did you strike the right balance between listening, talking, and doing?
Doing and listening are probably the most important. So one, making sure you listen to people's concerns, and then doing is not only exhibiting the behavior or the change that that you're looking for, but actually following through, right? So if you're promising information on a certain schedule, making sure you follow that schedule, make sure you release information. The talking is important, obviously, but I think it's usually the talking, you're not really giving, you know what you're going to say, and you keep giving them the same information, right? It's the listening where you get sort of the reaction to what you're saying, and then the doing is your commitment. So I would almost put those two a little higher than talking.
All right. Thanks for that answer. All right, next question. How will you promote diversity and inclusion in this new office?
That's a good question. So, and it's two different things, right? So diversity is both diversity in terms of our workforce, diversity in terms of how we think, and inclusion is making sure the staff we have feels included, right, and is involved in how we operate our office. In terms of diversity, I think it's important to hire different people who can bring different perspectives. This is not just based on sex or race, right? It's having a different way that people look at things. Now you need that balance as well, because frankly, if you get everybody in the room that looks the same, you're probably not going to have the same type of diversity in terms of views and thought. We have, as we hire people, we're looking broadly, right? We're not trying to limit to the same approaches like USA Jobs. We're also looking at job fairs. We're looking at targeted opportunities to get a more diverse workflow. Workforce. In terms of inclusion, it's it's really how we operate, right? It's simple things like copying people that you should, that may benefit from having a certain piece of information. It's things we're doing now, even as just in the last couple of weeks. Over time, we've tried to expand our staff meetings so that more and more people are there hearing what's going on in the organization. And just this week, we decided, why are our staff meetings limited at all? While we may only have a few people actually briefing, we're going to open it up to all the staff, right? There's no reason they shouldn't hear what's going on, even though just a few people may be talking. So there are lots of things you can do like that to promote inclusion. I will say, we're actually, just like everything else, and I talked about a change champion, we're actually looking to have people identified as champions. And Marnie's is on this call. She's one of those people we've identified to help us focus, right, our energies on inclusion and on diversity. It's I can tell you, doing your day-to-day job, while we may all absolutely agree that this is important, we must do this, it's so easy to get distracted, right? Just like I was talking about having a change champion. I think it's true here too. I think you've got to have a champion that's focused on making sure we're doing the right thing. It can't always just fall to the leadership.
Absolutely. Next question. When starting a new project, do you sometimes pull together tiger teams, pull from different groups to get the best output?
Absolutely, and it's in fact where we're headed, right? I talked a little bit about our migration to the cloud. And in that environment, and in an agile environment, it's absolutely critical that we have IPTs and teams that comprise our users, our developers, our operators, our scientists, our security people. So as we start doing new projects, we will have much broader teams comprised of different skill sets to implement a project. And I'll say this is a big change. This is a cultural change. As an organization, we've been used to managing a project. You've got your set of engineers, you've got software developers, usually you have total control, and they're all within your office, right? It's very rare for you to expand that to include people from other offices. That's a cultural change that, we necessarily don't have control or authority over over the whole staff. Am I frozen, or can you hear me?
Oh, I heard you loud and clear.
Okay. Sorry, my
All right.
my computer just froze.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, next question. Do you personally mentor anyone at Noaa?
Yeah, over the years, I've mentored a fair number of people, officially and unofficially. And I'll tell you, there are the official DOC, and I think even NESDIS has a mentoring program. It's a great way to make connections, but I found that informal mentoring relationships are just as valuable. And I've actually maintained, I've been in touch with, and I maintain contact with people that used to be formal mentees, but now, we just keep in touch. And then it's that relationship, I think works well. You don't have sort of the overhead of a formal mentoring relationship. And I will tell you, I get a lot out of it as well. Sometimes it sometimes helps to talk about the organization, talk about what you want to do and how to accomplish things. As I mentioned earlier, as we were going through this reorg, as I was putting together the slides, at that point I learned, hey, I don't think I'm doing this reorganization as well as I'd like to. So I get something out of mentoring relationships, and I'd say there are a few people now that even though they've left the agencies, I still have a mentoring tag up with them once a month or so.
Great answer. Sometimes the mentor learns as much as the mentee.
Yep.
All right, next question. How can you engage the team through different strategies, and how do you know if those strategies are working?
Not sure I'm really following. Could you repeat that?
All right, let me try this again. How can you engage the team through different strategies, and how do you know that if those strategies are working?
How do you know if they're working? That goes back to what we talked about earlier about listening. You know, direct feedback is the best way to determine whether what you're doing is, whether you're successful or not. In terms of employing different strategies, I feel like sometimes it's overwhelming, right? In fact, within NESDIS, we just had our spring planning meeting. We were talking about all the ways to engage the workforce, to promote diversity, promote inclusion, and frankly, it's just overwhelming. There's so many things we could be doing. There's so many things you can read up on. And clearly, we can't do everything, right? Because then we won't do the few things we need to and do them right. So after after you sort of select what you want to do, I think the best way to determine if the strategy is working is to engage staff directly. They're the best ones that can tell you whether what you're doing is working or not, and be prepared to change. I think we've got to be careful that we don't sort of lay out a plan and then follow it blindly, right? We're dealing with people. It's important to be flexible.
All right, sounds great. All right, we have a couple more questions. All right, first, I already asked that one, sorry. How can government employees and affiliates help you succeed with this change challenge?
Well, participate, right? Be active. There's a, oops, sorry about that. Be active participants in the change. It is hard to embrace. I think we all realize that. But look for ways that the change will help you in your career. Look for ways that you're going to be doing something new. Look at this as a learning experience, right? Instead of focusing on what you're giving up, focus on what you're doing. That's a great way, because that type of attitude is contagious, right? Once you get a few people that are embracing the change, it becomes a lot harder. It becomes a lot easier for the rest of the organization to adapt.
All right. And this last one is more of a comment, not necessarily a question. That the answer you gave for your last question, having non-government experience provides a tremendous insight that may have otherwise been overlooked. I couldn't agree more. So that was the comment.
Yeah, and it's a great comment. You know, some of us, a lot of us have been in the government a long time, and even though I came from the private sector, I can't tell you that my experiences are still relevant. So I know we've had people come in and out that have come from the private sector. They give a great perspective. That goes back to what we talked about, diversity, right? It's the diversity of thought. Getting people from outside of government is a great way to get insight. And at the end of the day, you know, we're all people. Their experiences, I think, are applicable to what we do.
All right. Well, Ajay, thank you very much for your time in the Q&A session. I will now hand this off back to Tracy.
Okay, great. And I'm going to pass it off to Katie. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Ajay, and everyone. Any last words?
No, just thank you again for the opportunity to talk. I enjoyed it. As I said, I always learn something as well, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Ajay, for a terrific talk. And Marnie Brown and Dwayne Bola, thanks for moderating the questions. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Our next NOAA Environmental Leadership Seminar is on June 23rd, and our speaker will be Joseph Pica of NOAA's NESDIS National Centers for Environmental Information, better known as NCEI. We hope you will join us. When you leave today, you'll be taken to the NESDIS OSGS site. Thank you and goodbye.